example, we set up here, so you have a speaker shot like this, but then you cannot see it. So we can do that. Zoom out a little bit so we see some of the head people listen. Because when you just have the speaker outside by themselves, it feels like
Don't worry. I can go around you.
You want a medium shot?
No, or medium shot, and then wide shot.
I don't know why someone has got the toilet roll in the conference room. Maybe you're ready to cry. You never answered my WhatsApp. Huh?
Wait for it.
Here. Is it?
Yeah, it's okay. Because we use cutaway. Don't forget to cutaway.
You have to do it so it doesn't have to read on the end. There is a setting on iPhone.
Should we bring it in? Try I think maybe this is the best.
That is really
I think so. You will not have to see. Last year.
This K,
Yeah, can. That's nice actually. That's nice. And then the speaker will be very small. So you do two camera shots. You can zoom in on the speaker. Yeah. Speaks by and then also there's two choices. Okay. I think it's right. So here you will because you cannot get closer than this is maximum. Yeah.
Check focus.
Yeah.
No frame. It's not frame.
Yeah. It's okay. This looks nice. And the speaker will be small, but it's okay. But try to zoom in as well as much as possible. Try it 2 times the shots.
Okay, that's great if you can do that. I mean, I also feel like when they were doing their feedback into some of the presentation, maybe like jot down.
See, that stresses me out when somebody trips over and falls.
Put it on one.
Just like just keep don't do that. You never know.
Hey, I know this whole section is cool now.
Bloody creepy. Yeah, I know, this is dangerous.
I know, it really is.
We're going to add a tripod to this just to...
Oh yeah,
really
one can...
nice.
I mean, this is...
This is your computer.
I did, yeah, I saw that. Just yeah. Yeah. So if you're around, I think it'll be quick.
That's kind of what I've designed myself to as well. I'm good. I'm looking good.
Everything good then?
Yes. Please check the.
Oh, brilliant.
Yes. So that's how it's gonna look. So it should be okay, right?
So yeah, I mean, I'll let the speaker be there, and even if I move to the other side, great work. Great work.
It's live already.
Yeah,
So it's okay. Just keep running. Just before no.
Yeah, no, sorry, this is really
Almost.
Yeah, I'm going to do this with the way because that's not even doing.
So it's working at that source to make me focus.
No, sure. Well, no, that's good because that's one of the things that I don't really focus on.
The software and everything.
So you managed to get that. So a bit of a stressful start.
Everything's okay.
It wouldn't be like a stream session like that.
We got time, so it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. You can like relax.
So I'm just testing.
Yeah, I can check in the.
Do not open it.
But not going.
Do not open it. The moment you open it.
Oh, the void's the warranty.
Yes, yes. So then you're not covering it.
Yeah, I see. That's a good thing because I did try. I was trying to try this.
Because they are correct everything. That's perfect.
It might be good to give a sync now. But I mean,
I would suggest directly to a port and let it just stay on.
and then wire it
I don't know if there's any in the hotel.
tell them the room is and they'll have to write it down. And then at 12 o'clock on the door, we'll just make habits that they switch. You don't have much choice. Unless we decide. So if it's not Eugene, if we know that we can stay there, so wherever Eugene is, he stays there. Whichever working day he's in. Do you know where he works? Wherever Chris and she's is, she stays here. So that the masterclass leads don't have to be running around. You do that? We can't have them. The trouble is we can't have 10 minutes of people walking around things because they're used to being
doesn't work like this. Like at the time of the switch, like we go there to the room and sometimes we just go to the room and say, okay, and then I mean, in any case, people have to move, right?
Morning. Of course.
So
Yeah, it's
and then when we get
okay.
the markets,
I mean, it's okay. Let's just go for it. You know. The most important, at least the projectors on stuff, the individual staff. There's no technical.
Yeah, there's no
Literally, it's just people. And moving people sometimes is a really easy thing. And then the working leads when we meet with corporate, we should tell them, you've got to make the move, and you've got to make the move. So even if you've got like those discussions, please do it. Get out there and do it. Yeah.
what I can do is that I can write on paper the
really good at it. I don't think they put syrup in it. There's just enough banana to make it super sweet.
Better, yeah. But antibiotics messes you up in all sorts of other ways.
Yeah.
But currently it's very good.
Yeah, I think it's going to work.
Hello. Okay.
Slowly.
Are you ephemeral PH at so will you be able to work with us? Sabi ni Miss Josie, she won't just our meeting with Miss sagot lang ni Miss Josie, I am at the ephemeral PHCD. Miss Tess. We had a call. We had a global call last night. Started at 7:30 and she left at 9:30. We're so hungry. Kamusta siya? Madaming tao.
I don't know. Is that what you market? I'm like, I marked out the space. Getting better.
I always use this if I'm runs at top schools. There's a woman that said, I love your shirt.
Yeah, it was
very
colorful.
So I work with the ex.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
We were so. Yeah, they're definitely cool. So the last where the Toby
For the fishers to adapt, one is
yeah, that's right.
working near shore fishers. So, municipal waters are very contaminated. So we have all these issues where we have fisher vessels. That's what the flagship program. So we really empower the community. It's also their mandate. We're actually helping them make sure it's the mandate of the government.
At printer, and then try to see if you can find THPPK printer tool. Yes, printer tool. Just
Known as territorial user rights for fisheries. So that's another layer.
okay, it's okay.
It's national rights.
I missed it long enough. There's some tags on the table.
There was a great. I've never been to that.
Maybe nondescript picture. El Machado outside.
There's some people who like this type of
Okay, good morning everybody. It's 9 o'clock, so we are going to start in a couple of minutes as I let the last few people come in. I would like to, although I've just told everybody they can sit wherever they like, I would like to invite the people who are just going to kick off the next session to sit at this table here. So I'm just going to kick you guys off, sorry. To sit at this table here. So if you're one of the people I met with yesterday who's going to talk this morning about their perspective on yesterday, would you like to come and sit here? Yeah. It's just easier for me to have you here.
I think you just have to.
That's right, Duan and his friends. Where are all your lady friends? Have you left them behind?
No, I don't think that we have any. I am told some messages. I work global development. I work primarily in health and research development, which is what I work in. But the 360 education, environment, social and economic development, governance, everything. Things I know nothing about. And you are all right. Okay. Thanks. So you made a long trip out there. Yeah, we had a bit of holiday. Oh, okay. Yeah, not a bad way to do it.
You can sit here and you sit here.
It's just that we're filming from there.
So can you change this table? You guys can sit there and then I'll move the rest of the side. Sorry.
Yeah, so this side is all fine. It's more just
Okay.
yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm not sure I have everybody, but if you are like you're going to speak in the community, in the perspective session in 2 minutes, I need you sitting on the same table as Doan. Here. So can you come and sit here if you are already, you know that I met with you yesterday. I know there are some ladies, that's why I'm concerned now because it's all men. Not that, you know, I'm against men, but...
Is there any way we can pause the stream until it begins?
Okay. Alright. Where is she gone? She's gone away.
I'll just say.
Okay. So if you're just coming in the room, can I ask you to take a seat quickly so that we don't disturb and we can move on? We have tight timing again today. So welcome back to the second day. Hopefully you enjoyed the first day. There was a lot of activities yesterday, a lot of moving around. I saw a lot of side meetings going on. Can I have your attention? Because if otherwise, it's so, like super lots of back chat noise. Okay. We had quite a lot of fun, I think, whether that was logging into Facebook or eating chocolates. I saw someone left the chocolates behind and I reckon Monica ate them all. Or Monica is there, I think, with spare role.
Everything looks good, right, so far?
Yeah, I think now that we've got that as well, like the people who are watching at the moment, it's coming up. But I don't know whether it's like there's that iPad's terrible. It's so bad. I just don't know why.
I can see it in my phone.
Did you see that? Even I refreshed it. It says one comment. Oh, I think I might just do away with that iPad. There's something wrong with it.
Maybe you need to install the app. YouTube app. Better log on from YouTube.
Yeah, I think I'll just put that on my phone. Yeah. I'm going to manage it on my phone. What does that? Yeah, do you think we're all okay?
It's okay, right?
What I was saying, do you WhatsApp? Or maybe you'll hear and you'll manage that.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I don't want to disturb them, so I'll be listening from here also, in case of here also.
Yeah,
so I can manage everything.
That's easy. I mean, let's see.
Okay, if we can sit back down.
Good, here we go.
Yeah, it looks okay. The screen looks okay, right?
Okay, so I'm going to, I think many of you have already met Toby through your various interactions yesterday, but I'm going to introduce Toby from the Behavioural Insights Team. So he's going to make a presentation, and then after the presentation there will be a chance for you to ask questions. So we won't ask questions during the presentation, but if you do have a question, just note on a post-it, and then when we get to the end, there will be a chance for Q&A. So of course, you know, if you think of something as he's going through his slides, or he says something that you're specifically interested in, just write down your question, then at the end we will be able to take a few questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I feel like I've started to lose my voice a little bit, which is good timing. I guess that's a solid indication of the quality of the conversation last night. I'm sure it's got nothing to do with the wine at all. So please bear with me. So I'm going to talk to you for a bit about dishonest, corrupt, selfish behaviours and what behavioural science can tell us about those. I'll give you a slightly more detailed introduction to myself in a moment, but before I do that, I just wanted to jump straight into a bit of a pop quiz. So if you could just humour me for a few minutes, and just by show of hands, answer a few questions. So number one, imagine you're about to buy a new belt for $15.99, and you realise the exact same belt is available for $8.99 in another shop a 10-minute walk away. How many of you would walk to the other shop to get the cheaper belt? Alright, that's the vast majority of you, great. Okay, question two, you're going to need a pen and paper. So, if you just grab one of the post-it notes off the table and a pen, don't write anything down just yet. I'm going to read out a series of words to you, and I want you to remember as many of those words as you can, and then when they disappear from the screen, I'll ask you to write them down, okay? So just listen for now. Okay, table, sit, legs, seat, couch, desk, recliner, sofa, wood, cushion, swivel, stool, sitting, rocking, and bench. Okay, write as many of those down as you can remember. Okay, next question, by show of hands again. Imagine you're buying a new MacBook for $1,169, and you hear the exact same MacBook is available in another shop for $1,162, a 10-minute walk away. How many of you would walk to the other shop to get the cheaper MacBook? Okay, not so many. Great. I'll explain that in a moment, but just by way of introduction. So, I'm from the Behavioural Insights Team. I head up the energy and sustainability work there. And the Behavioural Insights Team is an organisation that started life in 10 Downing Street, which is the Prime Minister's office in the UK. And we've since spun out of government, but our remit is essentially to apply what we call behavioural insights to public policy and other social impact objectives. So when we say behavioural insights, what we're talking about is findings from psychology, economics, and in particular behavioural economics, anthropology and so on, combined with robust research and evaluation methods in order to try and supply a slightly more sophisticated and realistic understanding of human behaviour into the way that policy is made, or indeed campaigns and other sort of social impact interventions and initiatives. So it's about understanding how people really behave in the real world, in other words, and how we can use that more realistic understanding to achieve our objectives. And one of the key theories that we draw on a lot, which many of you may well be familiar with, is this idea that we tend to think with sort of two parallel systems. What Daniel Kahneman here, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, what he calls System 1 and System 2, or Thinking Fast and Slow, as the famous book is titled, that I'm sure many of you have read. But essentially what it says is that we have the ability to think quite sort of slowly, quite deliberatively, somewhat rationally, but actually a lot of our thinking happens very intuitively, very automatically, very rapidly. So for example, if I asked you what's 2 times 2, you would give me a response without even thinking about it. If I asked you to take your daily commute to work, you could do that essentially on autopilot without giving it any thought. Whereas if I ask you to plan a trip to a country that you've never been to before, of course you need to think about that much more carefully. But the main insight is actually much more of our decision making and our behaviour than we tend to realise is rooted in that System 1, in that fast automatic kind of thinking. And what that means is we're very, very sensitive to influence from our environment, because essentially we're walking around almost on autopilot a lot of the time, and so we're being very influenced by small details in our environment, sort of contextual factors. So for example, I asked you whether you'd walk 10 minutes to save $7 off of a MacBook, and I asked you whether you'd walk 10 minutes to save $7 off a belt. Almost all of you said you would do so for the belt, but very few of you said you would do so for the MacBook. Which does rather beg the question, would you walk 10 minutes for $7? So to a classical economist, that's exactly the same situation. But of course, to a psychologist, to a human being, it's not the same situation. We tend to be sensitive to the context in which that sort of that choice set is framed. So technically, this is what we call proportional price evaluation, which is that we tend to perceive prices not in objective absolute terms, but of course proportionally. So $7 off of 15 is much more significant than $7 off of 1,000. So the key insight there is that context really, really matters a lot, of course, but also that we tend to have these sort of biases that distort our judgment in quite predictable ways. Another example, if I offered you a coffee and I said, please choose which size coffee you want, the majority of people opt for the medium. Of course, there's some variety there, but most people will go for the medium. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small one's a bit too small for me, the big one's a bit too big for me, the medium is the right size. You then put a bigger one there, and you take away the small one, and you offer them the nude set, and you say, which one do you want? And they say, I'll have the medium, please. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small one's a bit too small, the big one's a bit too big, the medium is the right size. So of course what's happening there is our choice is entirely influenced by the way that the choice set is framed to us, but we're kind of retrospectively overlaying a more objective, rational explanation to that decision. But really it's the environment that's steering us more than our sort of objective, rational judgment. And this is sort of a cognitive equivalent of the sort of visual illusions, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So if you look at the two squares there, labeled A and B, of course in this context we know it's a visual illusion, or I wouldn't be presenting it, but nonetheless I think if we're honest with ourselves we would say that A looks rather darker than B, but actually they are exactly the same shade of grey. And so we can see this quite intuitively when it's presented to us as a visual illusion, but the point is our brain works like this in all manner of ways, including when we're making judgments and decisions in the world around us. Sorry. Okay, so let's see. Do you remember these words? So, by show of hands, who amongst you got table? Okay, great. That one tends to be quite easy because it was at the beginning of the list, so we tend to remember that more easily. What about desk? Yeah, not so many. Okay. Cushion? Okay. Oops. Sit? Okay, it's pretty impressive. And chair? Alright, well that one is most impressive because chair wasn't actually on the list. So well done to those of you that got that. So of course, what that shows again is simply that our brain tends to work in ways which are quite opaque to us. Of course, our memory is not a perfect storage of data and information. It works through association in this case. Of course, all of these words kind of associated with the word chair. But again, it's just a fun way to highlight that we don't often know what's going on in our brains. We make decisions and recall information, form memories in ways that are quite intriguing. And so we can use this in a number of ways, all of these kind of behavioural insights, particularly in policy making. And policymakers tend to use a variety of standard tools. So for example, we think about regulation, which is a behaviour change tool because you're talking about influencing people's behaviour through the force of law or the threat of penalty. We could use incentives, so taxes, subsidies, grants, fines, etc. And that's about limiting and influencing behaviour through some kind of economic cost or reward. We could use information, campaigns, awareness raising, labels and so on. So that aims to maintain people's freedom of choice, but it informs people, it persuades people. And behavioural insights offers us a fourth category, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is this idea of nudging. So that's essentially the idea that you can gently influence people's behaviour without necessarily restricting their choice by changing the environment they're in, changing the way information is presented, giving them small reminders and prompts, these sort of subtle ways, harnessing what we know about people's behaviour to direct their choices without being too restrictive. So that's really all about behavioural insights, but one important point is that actually behavioural insights has a lot to say about these conventional methods as well. We can make information more effective by understanding how people interpret it, remember it, and so on. We can make incentives more effective by understanding the ways that people sometimes quite counterintuitively respond to incentives, and so on. So just to give you some examples of the kind of impacts you can have by drawing on these insights, one really powerful tool is to think about defaults. So if you default people into something, still allowing them to choose to do whatever they want, but the default is that they will get this service or they will be signed up for something, then that can have an enormous impact. So for example, defaulting people into renewable electricity tariffs, there's a study in Germany that showed that led to a 10 times increase in the number of people on renewable electricity tariffs. And they still have exactly the same freedom of choice to choose what tariff they want, but the automatic one they get is the green one. And that is far more effective than any kind of campaign trying to encourage people to proactively switch to a green tariff. And we see the same, by the way, in things like savings programs. If you default people into pension plans or rainy day savings programs, that's incredibly effective. We can also think about introducing or removing what we call small friction costs or points of hassle or inconvenience. So for instance, this image refers to a study which showed that simply removing the tray in a canteen environment reduced food waste by around 40%. Because then of course it's slightly more difficult to take too much food. You can still go back and get seconds and so on, but just because you can't easily overload your tray with all these items you're not going to eat, you can significantly reduce food waste. Similarly, in the UK in the mid-90s, regulations changed so that paracetamol could no longer be sold in the pots, but had to be sold in these blister packs, so you had to take them out individually, and there was a limitation on how much you could buy in a single shop in one go. And that led to a significant reduction in suicides from paracetamol, because now it's just slightly more difficult to get too much paracetamol or to take a lot in one go. And finally, we think a lot about social norms. So this is the idea that we're very much influenced by what other people are doing around us for various reasons. And so simply telling people what most people like them are doing can be quite influential. So we ran a trial with HMRC, which is the tax authority in the UK, and by simply adding one sentence to a letter, which was 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, which is true, and sending that letter to late payers, we brought forward £200 million in late tax payments from a completely costless intervention, of course, because the letter's being sent out anyway, and we just added one sentence to the letter. So we can have surprisingly profound effects from using these kind of techniques. Not always, we also often have very modest effects, but the point is they're often quite cost-effective ways of intervening. So you're probably wondering now what all this has to do with illegal or corrupt antisocial behaviour and so on. So what I want to do now is I want to run through some of the sort of key insights that emerge from the research on this, and most of that tends to come from the laboratory. So the most common form of research on cheating, illegal behaviour and so on is to set up sort of games so that people play games and then you observe how much they cheat, and you can change the conditions of those games to sort of mimic different scenarios. So it might feel a bit detached from the real world, but I want to go through some of these key insights, and then I go through some of the kind of applications in the real world, but just to sort of, I'm going to know false pretenses here. I don't have all the answers as to how this does apply to the illegal wildlife trade, but I hope there's enough here that we can have a bit of a conversation and some interesting things that might feel quite relevant. So I think the first thing to say is that the rational choice idea, which tends to be the sort of set of ideas that dominates in policymakers' minds, is that illegal or corrupt or dishonest behaviour emerges because, well, firstly, we are inherently selfish or self-interested individuals, and essentially the benefits of being dishonest outweigh the costs, and or there is a low risk of being caught or an insignificant punishment. And so the implications of that would be that we should use some form of ban or regulation or a harsh penalty. In other words, we should ensure that actually the costs of cheating are higher than the benefits, and we might do that by having stricter punishment or increasing the risk of someone being caught. That's sort of conventional wisdom, and of course there is a lot of truth to that, so I'm not going to say that's wrong. That is an important part of the question, but it's not the whole picture. Partly because we know that bans and regulations often don't work. So to give you an obvious example of where a ban doesn't work, trying to ban alcohol consumption. I mean, that's been tried historically in a number of places and it's consistently failed. And the reason for that is it has a lot of sort of characteristics which are just not well suited to a ban. So for example, the market for alcohol is very established, so you're trying to stop something that's already widespread and has a very established market. And consumers already have a very strong motivation to continue drinking. There's not an easy sort of substitute, so people will tend to find a way. Secondly, the production and supply of alcohol tends to be distributed, so actually enforcement and targeting of enforcement is very difficult. And thirdly, legal alternatives to alcohol are not particularly obvious or available. And finally, the activity of drinking tends to be quite private, or certainly it can be private, so again, actually enforcement or monitoring is incredibly difficult as well. So in those kind of situations, bans and regulations are often quite ineffective. Just by way of contrast, someone asked me recently whether I thought a ban on plastic drinking straws was a good idea in the UK. And I thought, actually, yes, it probably is, because in a sense it has characteristics that are very different. So firstly, actually the motivations to use a straw are relatively weak. Most of us are quite happy to have a drink without a straw. Secondly, production and retail of straws is quite easy to actually monitor if you're targeting shops. And thirdly, actually the selling of them and the use of them is largely public. And legal alternatives, in other words, very rapidly the market will produce paper straws or bamboo straws or whatever. So in that instance, a ban would tend to be quite effective. So we have this sort of spectrum of different situations where bans and regulations may be effective or ineffective. So an obvious question is, well, where does poaching, trading and consumption of illegal wildlife products sit on that? I would argue probably somewhere in the middle, but perhaps slightly more to the left in many regards. So Clearly there can be huge successes from banning products. We've seen that in China, but it's not going to achieve the whole thing, and there are certain challenges there with using bans. So we want to think about other ways to sort of supplement and improve that. So what other behavioural factors drive dishonest behaviour? Okay, so here's a few sort of nuggets, a few insights that come from the research. So firstly, the idea of normalisation. If everybody else seems to be doing it, then we're happy doing it. Secondly, this idea of omission bias. What that essentially means is we're much more willing to be dishonest or cheat by omission, in other words, by not doing something, than we are to be dishonest or cheat by proactively doing something. So to give you an everyday example, imagine you're in a shop and you're buying something. You're very unlikely to deliberately try and scam the shopkeeper and give them too little money. That would be quite an extreme thing to do. But if they accidentally give you too much change and you notice that, many of us might just sort of let that go and just take the change. So we're much more likely to allow something dishonest to happen that favours us than we are to proactively do something that's dishonest. Thirdly, this idea of a sort of fudge factor, which essentially means that a lot of us tend to be slightly dishonest, and as long as we're only slightly dishonest, we can sort of find an excuse for that. And in fact, if we've not been as dishonest as we could have been, we might even think of ourselves as quite good people, because we've actually refused the opportunity to really cheat, so we've just taken a little bit. And I'll show you some research in a moment that shows actually most of us tend to do that. Fourthly, this idea of categorization. So if it's not money, if it's something else, we're more likely to take a favour or a gift. Next, splitting the spoils. So if you're doing it for someone else's benefit, or if you're sharing the outcome of your dishonesty, that tends to license it a bit more, and we're more inclined to be dishonest. That's very relevant, of course. Some of the conversations yesterday, we were talking about people buying tiger amulets for a family member, people buying pangolin scales because they feel like they really want the best medication for a family member. If you feel like it's not in your interest, then that really removes that sort of guilt factor. Somewhat relatedly is this idea of moral licensing. So we tend to use a previous good act, or we tend to focus on our virtues and our integrity in order to justify a subsequent bad act. Or indeed, if something bad has happened to us, maybe because we feel we're not paid enough, for example, we use that as an excuse to sort of morally make the bad behaviour acceptable. The lack of victim, of course, if you feel that the animal is dead anyway, it wasn't me, that could be very relevant. And so all of these things are sort of forms of what I would call fudge factors or rationalizations. We draw on these sort of excuses to justify our bad behaviour. And of course, what makes them so effective is there's often a bit of truth in them, but nonetheless we sort of stretch that to our advantage. But then there are also some sort of circumstantial factors which also exacerbate dishonesty. So things like scarcity, by which I mean, if the opportunity to benefit from dishonesty is running out, if there's like a last opportunity, we tend to go for it and try and get the most we can. And similarly, the fact that if dishonesty is very easy, it's very easy to cheat and the opportunity is right there, we will tend to do so more. So that's sort of an idea of friction or hassle. If it's a bit more difficult to be dishonest, that can be quite effective. So I'm going to run through some of these sort of games, these sort of laboratory experiments I mentioned. So please, while I'm doing so, have a think in your mind, how might this be relevant to my context? Because it's not necessarily immediately obvious when you look at these slightly abstract experiments, but I think within each of them there's quite an interesting insight. So this is a quote from some of the most seminal research on dishonesty, and the way they summarize their findings is that people generally like to think of themselves as honest. However, dishonesty pays, and it often pays well. So how do people resolve this tension? Well, their research shows that people tend to behave dishonestly enough that they can profit from that, but honestly enough to continue deluding themselves of their own integrity. So a little bit of dishonesty gives a taste of the profit without actually spoiling that sort of positive self-image. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, okay, not me. But actually, the evidence suggests that most of us do this, whether it's just sort of stretching your timesheet a little bit, whether it's maybe being a bit generous on your expenses claim. We tend to sort of fudge things ever so slightly. So I'll give you a bit of evidence of that. So this is a typical sort of laboratory study where in this case the researchers set up a series of maths tests. And the idea was that you got a payment depending how many questions you got right, but the number of questions you got right was totally self-reported, so it depended on you being honest. And then at the end of the test, you went and you put your test in a shredder, so you were convinced that the researcher wouldn't know how many you got right, but actually the shredder was fake, it didn't actually shred the paper. So then you can observe, well, how many do people actually get right and how many are they claiming they got right in order to get the payment. And so what happened here, there were 20 questions. On average, people actually got 4 of them right out of 20. This was under sort of tight time limit. But people on average claim they got 6 right. And this has been going on for a number of years. And these researchers have now done this with 40,000 people, which is a huge sample size for this kind of experiment. But what's really interesting is only 20 people out of that 40,000 went full hog and claimed they got 20 right. You know, there was anyone could have done that. There was no consequences. You could have all just said, yeah, I got them all right, I'll take the money. But very, very few people do that. But the majority, so 28,000 out of the 40,000 were sort of minor cheaters, and then they just nudged their score up a little bit. And they can probably justify that to themselves, like, oh, you know, I almost got that one right, or I probably would have done it if I had like another 10 seconds or whatever. So 70% of us tend to cheat a little bit. A similar study, imagine you get given a dice, you're asked to roll it, and you get a payment depending on the number on the dice. If you get a 6, you get nothing at all. But if you get a 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, you get 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 Swiss francs depending on that roll. And again, this is done anonymously, so you just have to tell the researcher what you rolled to get the money. So of course you would expect that 1/6 of people would get each one, and if you do this over a large number of people, you can obviously look at the extent to which people are cheating. And what we find, of course, is that no, not 1/6 of people seem to get each roll, rather a lot of people seem to roll a 5. So 35% of people roll a 5, that's the maximum payout. Very few people roll a 6, which is 0 payout. But what's interesting is that actually not everybody cheats maximally again. Not everyone goes for the 5. A lot of people are saying they got a 4. So they're not getting the maximum payout there, but they're just nudging themselves up a little bit. And there's a really interesting follow-up to this study where if the maximum payout was on a 3 rather than a 5, even more people claimed they got a 3 because there are 2 ways you can cheat just a little bit. I.e., if you roll a 2 or a 4, you could just sort of nudge that to a 3. Whereas if a 6 was the maximum payout, or in this case 5, with a 6 being nothing, there's only one way you can cheat a little bit towards the maximum, i.e. if you roll a 4. So we are absolute consummate geniuses of the way we sort of find these intricate ways to sort of benefit ourselves without undermining too much our sense of integrity. So let's see what happens if you add in a few other variables. Let's say rather than getting money, with this is again the same sort of maths quiz experiment, rather than getting money, you get tokens, and then you exchange those tokens for money. So this puts an additional step between the cheating and the money. And the hypothesis is that actually we're much more likely to cheat when it's not for money. You know, when it's money, it's a bit more visceral and we feel a bit more guilty. So if you can distance yourself from the money, we're more likely to cheat. And that is exactly what they found. So don't worry about reading all of that, but essentially the level of cheating more or less doubled when you had these tokens. So 3.5 questions out of 20 was the number that people actually got right. People that were given money claimed they got 6.2. People that were getting tokens claimed they got 9.4. So it's a roughly doubling of the cheating. Okay, let's skip over that. Okay, what about another sort of variable we can add into the mix? This idea that you're doing it for someone else's benefit, or you're sharing the spoils, the money. So this is another sort of similar experiment where people were given essentially an unsolvable puzzle. There was no correct answer to this puzzle, so anybody that claimed they solved it is lying. When they're just taking the money themselves, 21% of people claim they solved it, 21% seem to be lying. But when you're in a situation where you were sharing that money with someone else, it doubled to 43% of people claiming that they solved the puzzle. And again, I hope you can immediately see the sort of relevance of this, that we tend to rationalise these things along the lines of, well, you know, it's not for me, it's for the benefit of my family that I'm doing this, or, you know, I will if you will. There's a sense of collusion if you're maybe with a colleague and two people are being corrupt and so on. So it's very dangerous when there are these sort of social licensing effects where other people's benefit sort of licenses your ability to do the wrong thing. And a related concept to this is, what if you observe other people cheating? And of course this is a huge problem with corruption, systemic corruption, where it's completely normalised. If you're in a situation where many other people are doing it, you're much more likely to do it. And that's essentially what this study found. Again, it's another variation of this sort of maths test experiment, but actually they had an actor in the room, someone who was pretending to also be taking this test, who very obviously cheated. They claimed to have finished the whole quiz in like a minute, and just claim the full marks and take all the money, very, obviously. So it was clear to the real participants that actually there was cheating going on. But what's interesting is that they manipulated the extent whether that person looked like someone that's sort of like you in your in-group, and that was done by they belonged to the same university, they were wearing a sort of university jumper, or they belonged to a competitor university that there was some rivalry between. And where the person cheating was your in-group, i.e. you perceived them to be like you, and they cheated, you cheated much more as well. But where they were an out-group, and you perceived them as different, actually you cheated less, because you wanted to sort of differentiate yourselves from their behaviour. So there's something really interesting about perception of identity there, if you're trying to stop cheating or dishonest behaviour from spreading. Okay. Now, in the real world, there's some interesting evidence of this as well. It's what we call the broken windows effect, which shows that, again, dishonest behaviour or petty crime can really spread if it's perceived to be normal. So a series of experiments here have shown that with littering, for example, if you have a street like this and it's covered in graffiti, people are much more likely to litter than if it's not covered in graffiti. So in other words, one sort of evidence of one crime can actually exacerbate another crime. So in this instance, where there was no graffiti, about 30% of people littered, and this was done experimentally by putting leaflets on people's bikes and seeing if they chucked them in the bin or just chucked them on the floor. So 30% of people put them on the floor, whereas if there was graffiti on the walls, that roughly doubled, or more than doubled, to nearly 70% of people. So again, this is a sort of quite powerful evidence that our perception of what's going on and what's normal and what's sort of acceptable is a really strong influence on our propensity to be dishonest or undertake antisocial behaviour. And that's been replicated in a number of different sort of contexts. So, for example, there's also evidence that graffiti increases the number of people stealing cash from a letterbox. Again, this is an experiment where they had some cash sticking out of an envelope in a letterbox in someone's house. And that roughly doubled the number of people stealing it if there was graffiti in the area. If there was litter on the floor, that also significantly increased the number of people stealing. And if there were bikes even just locked up illegally on a fence that said, "Do not lock your bikes here," that also increased the number of people trespassing across a route they weren't supposed to go through. So these may be slightly sort of abstract scenarios, but altogether it's quite convincingly shows that actually we tend to be much more dishonest and willing to partake in sort of mildly illegal behaviours when other people appear to be doing so as well. Okay, so what can we do about any of this? Well, I think the first thing we need to think about is this idea of normalisation. If everybody else is doing it, it's fine for me to do it. That's a big problem. Now, one technique that we've used to good effect for this in other contexts is this idea of highlighting the good, the desirable social norm. So telling people, actually, you know what, most people don't do this. Most people are doing the right thing. And the reason for that is that we have a very skewed perception, sort of conveniently skewed perception of what most people are doing. So this is just one study that we did with Ipsos Mori, just looking at the difference in people's perceptions of how many people actually avoid their tax and the reality. And people tend to believe that about 36% of other people are not fully paying their tax. The reality is nearer 6%. So if we have a really skewed perception of other people's dishonesty, and we know that other people's dishonesty promotes our own dishonesty, that's a bit of a problem. But of course it also suggests a solution. We can just update people's beliefs. We can tell them the true fact. So that was the basis of the study I mentioned earlier, where when we just added that one sentence, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, into the tax letters, was enough to bring forward £200 million in late tax payments. But this has also been shown to be effective in a wide range of contexts, particularly across some sustainability issues. So for example, you've probably all seen these little tags in hotel rooms encouraging you to reuse your towel, and normally they're based on an environmental message. And so in this particular study, the message that was, really generic, please reuse your towel to save the environment, etc., about 35% of people did. If you don't even mention the environment, and you just say most previous occupants of this room reused their towel, 49% of people reuse it. So that seems to be more effective than promoting the sort of environmentally based good thing, is actually just to tell people that actually most people are doing this. So we can think about trying to use that to sort of crack instances where people are being dishonest or indeed selfish or not contributing to a public good in the context of sustainable resource, for example. A related idea is this idea of making behaviours much more observable. So we are much more inclined to do the expected good thing when we're being observed. This is a very sort of core tenet of psychology. When you think about that norms and conformity tend to work, we conform to the expected norm behaviour, more so when we're being observed. And again, there are a number of studies that have shown this to be effective. So I'll go through these very quickly. There's a lot of information on these slides, but you will be able to keep the slides, so they should be kind of self-explanatory for you if you want to read them afterwards. But for example, donations to a national park were increased when they were made sort of transparent, so you couldn't just put it in a black box, but people could see how much you're giving, and that increased the volume of donations. In situations where payments are based on sort of honesty, when there's nobody there and you just have to put the money in a box, this one has mixed evidence, but there's a bit of evidence to suggest that even just something as simple as putting a pair of eyes on a poster above that box can increase payments, because that tendency to be sensitive to the fact that we're being watched is so deeply ingrained in us that seems to have a bit of an effect. You can use fake police officers to reduce traffic offences. I'm not sure that little guy with a hairdryer is the best example I've seen, but nonetheless, that seems to work. And of course, I know that some conservation organisations, including RARE, tend to use sort of public pledges to encourage people to stop overfishing and so on. And the point there is that by pledging publicly, so there's a sort of social cost to going against that pledge, can be quite effective. So what about this point that most of us tend to cheat a little bit, but then we sort of rationalise it, we make excuses for ourselves? How might we be able to address that? Well, one sort of category of intervention ideas is this idea, well, there's presumably a bit of a sort of a limit as to how much dishonesty we can reasonably excuse ourselves for before we start to feel a bit bad about it. So can we reduce the extent of dishonesty which we're able to sort of rationalise to ourselves? And one way of doing that is to try and elevate the sort of more positive aspects of our nature. So for example, by reinforcing an identity of virtue through a sense of national pride or duty or indeed religion has been shown to be effective in some situations. And then separately, one of the other issues we talked about was this idea of omission bias, which is that we tend to be more willing to be dishonest when it just sort of happens and we let it go rather than proactively doing something. So there we might think about, well, how can we sort of reframe the crime as though it's a proactive decision, so we don't let people sort of make that excuse. So we tested both of these ideas, and again, this is in the context of tax avoidance. This one's in Guatemala. So we were sending out letters again to people to encourage them to declare their tax, and we tried a variety of different letters. So the one that was around national pride had some things about, we really need this tax money to spend it on critical public services, please be an honest citizen and so on. Those kind of messages. We also tried a social norm, so in this case we can't say 9 out of 10 people pay their tax, because they don't. We can say 64.5% of Guatemalans declared their income tax, which is quite low, but we were interested to see if that worked. And then the sort of omission bias one here is trying to reframe it as a proactive dishonest behaviour. So this says, previously we've considered your failure to declare your tax an oversight. However, if you don't declare now, we will consider it an active choice. You may therefore be audited and could face the procedure established by law. So these are the results from a randomized controlled trial. So I won't bother explaining what that is, but essentially this is a sort of robust estimate of the impact of each of the different letters we did. So from left to right there, we have a control group that didn't receive any letters, and this is the average number, the average amount paid or declared in tax per participant in this study, essentially. We then sent out the original letter that the Guatemalan authorities had written. That was slightly better than having no letter at all. A behavioural letter was exactly the same as the original one. We just simplified it slightly to make it easier to understand. Had a sort of very small impact. The national pride one, where we injected this sense of national pride, good citizens pay their tax, etc., that seemed to bump it up quite a bit, which was encouraging. The social norms one, even more so, despite it only saying that 65% of people pay their tax on time. That's still encouraged. That's still higher than most people thought it was, so it still worked. And then finally that deliberate choice one, where we say, previously we'll accept it was an oversight, but this time if you don't do it, we'll take it as a choice. That roughly tripled the amount of tax collected relative to sending no letter, or doubled it relative to the Guatemalan's original letter. So quite simply, sort of reframing the issue there can be quite effective. Okay, I better speed up a bit. Just to expand on that point around sort of trying to accentuate people's sense of virtue or their identity of sort of good behaviour, religious commitments is one way that's been tested in a number of contexts to good effect. And so going back to our familiar study of sort of doing maths tests in a laboratory, the way they tested this there is that they split them into two groups. One of the groups were just asked to write down the name of 10 books they'd read recently, which is just a sort of spurious control group, doesn't really achieve anything. But the other group were asked to write down all they could remember from the 10 Commandments. And these weren't particularly religious people, it was just it was an American population. But nonetheless, it's a sort of priming thing, it sort of prompts people to think about honesty and so on. And they found that actually that more or less removed the cheating element. So by having that moral prompt, dropped the number of tests that they claimed to get right from 4.2 to 2.8, which was back in line with roughly how many they were getting right. So that more or less removed the cheating. And there are a number of ways you can think about priming people with a sense of honesty, some of which have good evidence, some of them don't so much, but they're perhaps worth exploring. So, for example, you can use sort of more ceremonial or sort of ritualistic, for example, if you join the police force, you might go through some kind of very pompous sort of ceremony in order to really embody you with that sense of professional identity. Uniforms, for example, there's mixed evidence on this, but there is some evidence that suggests that a uniform can help strengthen that sense of sort of professional identity. That said, it can also give a sense of power that can be abused, so it's not clear-cut, the evidence on that. Daily sort of declaration, so an obvious example of that is the American Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, but you can imagine a sort of similar technique to that in order to try and embody this sort of strong identity of honesty and integrity, or indeed, as I mentioned with that rare example previously, sort of public pledges, because we tend to be more consistent with ourselves when we're sort of observed by others and we sort of publicly pledged the intention. Okay, finally, moving away from this sort of fudge factor type thing, what about contextual factors? Well, one thing we know is that hassle, convenience, what we call friction costs, so sort of small points of effort, can be really disproportionately impactful from our behaviours, from our propensity to sort of complete a behaviour. So if we add in a friction, if we make being dishonest just slightly more difficult, it doesn't need to be an all-out ban, but if we just make it slightly more difficult, it can be disproportionately effective. So for example, there's a really great, interesting study from Germany that showed that when legislation was changed to mandate the use of helmets, motorcycle thefts dropped by 60%. And the reason for that is that it is no longer easy to opportunistically steal a motorbike, because if you don't happen to have a helmet with you, you'll get pulled over for not wearing a helmet, and then the police officer will know that you've stolen the bike. So there's a sort of like, you know, an unintended but very positive consequence. And interestingly, there was no sort of spillover effect or an increase in deaths of other vehicles. I mentioned the paracetamol example earlier, but I think it's a really powerful example of how introducing a small friction can still significantly reduce quite profound behaviours that you would think people would be intent on doing. But of course, in reality, a lot of suicides are done in the sort of heat of the moment, because there's an opportunity, because they're feeling particularly desperate at that moment. So if you can just add in those barriers, that can actually be quite effective. And perhaps my favourite example of a sort of behaviour-informed incentive, this is from China. So in order to reduce tax avoidance among firms, what they did was they put a state-mandated lottery ticket on the back of receipts. So what essentially that meant is that shoppers would ask for a receipt because they wanted the lottery ticket, and by producing a receipt it was then slightly more difficult for the firms to avoid tax because they had the receipt on their books. And so that significantly reduced tax evasion by companies. And the interesting point there is that because we tend to overestimate small probabilities and we focus kind of on the size of the prize rather than the sort of true expected, you know, very low value, because actually the odds of winning were incredibly low. So the expected value of that lottery is quite low, but we don't focus on that. We focus on the possibility of winning. So that was a very effective incentive to discourage tax evasion. Okay. So quite a lot gone through that. I'd be really interested to hear your ideas as to how this might apply to the illegal wildlife trade. But just to sort of summarise, so this idea of rational, self-interested behaviour, it's obviously a really important part of the problem, so we do need to still consider conventional methods like bans and enforcement and adjusting the incentives and so on. But of course that is not the whole picture. They can sometimes be ineffective, but they also overlook sort of more irrational, non-rational aspects of human nature. So one of the key insights is that actually all of us tend to cheat a little bit. We tend to fudge or sort of rationalise a bit of selfish or dishonest or cheating behaviour to just the right extent that we can get away with doing that without losing our sense of integrity or honesty. So if we can find ways to remove that sort of fudge factor, that can be quite effective. So we just discussed ideas like highlighting the positive social norms, so you can't make that excuse, oh, everybody's doing it. Making the action explicit, so in other words, you know, you're doing this deliberately, this is not just by omission. Or trying to promote people's sense of pro-social identity through things like uniforms or moral or religious prompts. And again, we talked about sort of small contextual details, including sort of friction costs and also how observable a behaviour is. But just to say, of course, we've only scratched the surface here, so I'm sure you can all think of things that we haven't talked about that are relevant. So we haven't talked about, for example, messenger effects, which is the fact that we're much more likely to pay attention to certain people than others. We haven't talked about how we can think about designing incentives to be more effective in order to encourage whistleblowing or other activities. We haven't talked about education. We haven't talked about empathy building, such as, you know, this idea that we're less likely to do something that harms a victim that's sort of identifiable rather than anonymous to us, and various other things. So really this sort of scratches the surface, but I try to pick out things that maybe are less familiar and perhaps have some sort of novel application to the illegal wildlife trade. So thank you very much. I'll finish there. Very happy to answer questions, so I realise I've probably more or less run out of time, but I'd be quite keen to look at a few minutes discussion to see whether people feel like that is relevant in their own context. Some of those ideas, like I say, are a little bit abstract, but it'd be great to hear what you think.
Okay, so we're going to take questions for 15 minutes. It's good if we can try to link it with the context that we're here to discuss as well. So maybe questions about, we can prioritise questions about how we relate it to the kinds of changes that we're trying to make in terms of changing wildlife consumers. So, any questions? I've only got 2 mics, so you'll have to bear with me running around.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, maybe more an observation, but hopefully helpful. One observation is that that makes things harder now in tackling wildlife crime is the increasing online nature of it. So your point about we're less likely to do bad things, cheat, if it's observable, it's very much less observable if you're doing it in the privacy of sitting in front of your computer, and possibly also that fast thinking, slow thinking thing comes in there where, you know, rather than have to walk even 3 minutes to the shop and get the money out or get the credit card out, you just click. So, which people have a tendency to do very rapidly. So that's one. The other is about only cheating a little bit, where there are illegal markets alongside legal markets. I think that makes it very much easier for people to feel, well, maybe that was, convince themselves that actually maybe that bit of ivory was actually from a legal source. The guy said it was from a legal source. I believed it was from a legal source. Maybe it wasn't, but I'm pretty sure it was. So I'm okay with that. It's only slightly risky.
Yeah, I completely agree. Ambiguity is the friend of rationalisation. If there's any ambiguity, we latch on to that in order to construe a rather convenient story for ourselves, and we see that in all different contexts. So if you can make crime very clear-cut and try and remove that ambiguity, that I think is beneficial. On the online point, I agree, it is problematic. I think there are potentially things you can do. I know that, depending on privacy laws and so on, and the kind of internet service that people are using, there are nonetheless possibilities of having sort of pop-up windows in response to certain searches. So it sort of gives the illusion that something or someone or some kind of authority is at least aware that you're looking at this stuff. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to try, even if it's not actually stopping you continuing the search and buying the product. Just this sense that, I'm not quite as anonymous as I thought I was, I think would be really interesting to test.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby. That's a very fresh perspective to what we're doing. I was just, trying to think about the analogies between the things that you have mentioned and the actual research on consumers that we conducted in Thailand and in China. Some are very valid, but it seems to me that our consumer segment is more like a subculture, a self-propagating subculture, in which the general population already knows that buying illegal wildlife is not socially acceptable. But amongst the consumer segment and those who desire to buy, it is very highly socially, they still think it's socially acceptable. They feel that they're not guilty at all about buying wildlife, because they feel as consumers, they're only buying small bits and pieces, and it's available in the market anyway, so it's the suppliers who should be penalized. And as you say, a lot of them are also buying it as gifts for medicinal value, for example. A lot in China, we have done reanalysis and gifting, medicinal value, medicinal benefits of the product underlies a lot of the gifting behaviors. And of course status, but status not amongst the general population, but amongst their social network. So it's a very difficult issue to tackle, because, as I said, it's like a self-propagating subculture. How do you break that? And a lot of it is also spiritual beliefs, which is highly ingrained and passed on from generation to generation, and still acceptable in a social network. So it's just how do you call it? Some things and ideas that I'm bouncing around. I'm not asking any questions, but just some insights.
Thank you. It's very insightful, and I completely agree. This is a really tough one to deal with. A lot of what you say, I think, resonates with what I presented, in that there are problems that it's normalized in certain groups. There are problems that it's bought as a gift or for other people's benefit. There are problems that it's easy to obtain, and so on. And in many ways, this is all useful to know, and it's a great way of diagnosing the problem, but it's not always obvious how to turn that into a practical solution, which is where the main challenge is. But I think there are still some things that would really be worth testing. So around the normalization aspect, is there actually good evidence out there to show, for example, as I showed with the tax example, there's a big disparity between people's perceptions of how normal it is and how normal it actually is. I mean, that would be an obvious first step, to do that research, quite easily done, just through surveys and so on, to get a sense, well, is there potentially a bit of leverage there that we could harness?
Okay, thanks. Another question?
Well, so maybe I'll put the question to, I think, what Nora was raising about the situation we're facing in China. you talked about the idea of highlighting social norms to make people sort of reframe the way they're looking at their behavior, maybe in the light of information that they didn't have before. I'm curious if there's been research looking at the efficacy of trying to create a social norm that maybe doesn't actually exist yet. So, and to give a specific example, you looked at, I believe it was Guatemala, was the other example where you sent the tax letter and you said, oh, well, we can't say 1 in 9 because that's not actually the case. But most people would not actually have access to that information. So I guess you could have said 1 in 9, even though it's not actually true. You could have implied a social reality that is not actually there. I'm just curious, leaving aside the ethics of that, I'm just curious about the efficacy of doing it.
So, yeah, you could say most, you could say the majority. As a sort of quasi-government organisation, we don't tend to leave aside the ethics. But no, it's an interesting point as to whether it would be effective regardless. And I think the thing is, for a norm message like that to be effective, it needs to meet a few conditions. It needs to be believable. And so if you ham it up too much and it's not believable, then that's probably going to backfire. But it also needs to correct people's perceptions in the correct direction. If you tell people that, so we actually tried this in Singapore, and I think we said 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, and it didn't have any effect. And we did a bit of research afterwards, and it turned out, well, that's because most people thought more than 9 out of 10 people already paid their tax. So in other words, we were undermining the existing perception. So it needs to be believable, it needs to push people in the right direction. But to the extent that you can say the great majority or the majority, that can be effective. But also there's a bit of interesting evidence emerging at the moment around this idea of dynamic norms, which is that if a relatively new behaviour, like buying an electric car, for example, is not yet normative, but it's increasing, you can say things like more and more people are buying, or the number of people buying an electric car is going up 5-fold every year. Because we have this sort of bandwagon type effect where we sort of want to jump on the bandwagon, or at least some people want to sort of jump on that. So that's, but again, there's very little research on that. It's been tested a little bit in a sustainability context. But if you could somehow allude to the fact that more and more people are starting to recognise that this is not acceptable to buy ivory or to have shark fin soup at your wedding or whatever, then we sort of become, we're sensitive to those shifting norms. And so again, I think that's worth exploring.
Okay. I have a question here, then have Gail, and have Jane, and then
This is just simple curiosity because of what Nora raised earlier, is that how much of a decision to have wildlife product is actually conscious and conscious act? Like, for example, I'm thinking about buying an ivory Buddha statue. I mean, that's going to cost me several $100. So is that a conscious decision, or is that something as intuitive as just having a bowl of shark fin soup? Because it's served to me and it just seems normal for me to just eat it because it's right there in front of me. I mean, just trying to figure out, would that make a difference in how people then react to the kind of interventions we do as well, being it being a conscious decision versus it being something that's intuitive or even culturally inherent or embedded?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think with wildlife consumption, there's a combination and a mixture, as you allude to. Something like buying an expensive piece of ivory, of course, it's going to be conscious. You don't do that accidentally. Whereas something like eating shark fin soup, as we were talking about yesterday in the context of a wedding, where it's the default, both to the couple who are organising the wedding, is presented as the default option, but of course to an attendant, a guest at the wedding, it's even more so the default because it's just right in front of you. So there will be different interventions as appropriate for each of those situations. If you're dealing with conscious, deliberate behaviour, you want to think about what are the incentives, what are the sort of underlying motivations, what needs and motives is this activity satisfying? Can we transfer that onto some other behaviour, for example? But also all of this stuff I've talked about rationalisation, I think is still very relevant because that contributes into the way that we justify and think about a behaviour. So that's all really relevant. If people are acting much more on autopilot, then we might want to think about making changes to the environment, the sort of classic choice architecture, nudge type stuff. So for example, if you could change the default, that would be the perfect thing. If people actually proactively choose to have shark fin soup rather than just being given to them, that would be very powerful, I'm sure. So I don't know, it would be interesting to map out of all the sort of behaviours that we're concerned about here, ranging from ivory to tiger to rosewood to shark fin soup, and then drilling down into the sort of micro behaviours within that. What are the specific decisions and activities going on? I don't know how many of them would sort of fall into the more conscious, deliberative and deliberate behaviours, and how many of them would be just quite automatic, going with the flow type things. I expect there'll be quite a spread, but I think that would be an interesting thing to do.
Thanks, Toby. That was really fascinating. I guess one of my key observations is a lot of the research data doesn't necessarily kind of come from many of the countries in which we're currently working. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on whether you think, for example, out of the working groups, whether one of the actions is that in some specific areas we really need to generate some more research insight to get fresh evidence about the balance of these different forces on consumer choice.
Yeah, I think that would be really great. So a lot of the laboratory research is done in the US. That said, actually, I think that sample, particularly that one with a sample of 40,000, I think that's a bit more global because they've done a lot of it online. But as is the problem actually with a lot of, as you know, with a lot of psychology research, the sample is often American grad students, which is not the most typical population. That said, there are clearly sort of fundamental universal traits with respect to human nature and decision making that are quite universal, but the way they manifest and the sort of content of that tends to be quite culture and context specific. So to give an example, we're all very much influenced by norms. We're all the same species. We're all evolved with a very powerful tendency to follow the crowd and to use our social environment as a sort of guide. But the content of those norms differs greatly from context to context. So you do really need to understand the context, even if you're using quite familiar sort of ideas. But yeah, I agree. To try and replicate some of that research in a different culture would be fascinating, just to get a sense of if there's any significant difference. I suspect we would see similar patterns, but who knows? Yeah.
So I just wanted to follow up on the chat about norms, about whether you can create a norm when it doesn't already exist. I think one of the exciting things that's coming out is the ability to use fiction to create new norms. And I know this is something Chris is going to talk about later, and Sean has a lot of work on. So I mean, there is a good bit of evidence in economics for where you see kind of where in soap operas, for example, you present kind of these exemplars in soap operas for. Like a famous example is in Brazil, where there was the fertility rate was extremely high, and there was kind of these exemplars in the soap operas where women would have like 0 or no kids, and they were able to show that reduced the fertility rate from kind of 6 or 7 to down to like 3 or 4, and they were able to show that it was actually the soap opera doing that by controlling for a number of factors. Similarly, in India, they were able to kind of change how kind of the role of women in society by kind of through the kind of representation of agentic women in films. So one of the things to think about there is that while it is true that things need to be believable, one exception to that rule is that it seems to be the case in fiction that one of the things that stories do is they suspend people's disbelief. So it's actually possible to try and use fictive narratives to kind of change a social norm. I think it's most relevant probably when there's a ubiquitous social norm at the macro social level. I think if you're talking about very targeted groups, like the way you're discussing, I think maybe the soap opera might not be the particularly effective way. But if there is something where it's like deeply embedded in the society, I think some of the script writing really is something to be thinking about.
I'm just thinking about the suggestion of using like a pride and identity and virtue. I'm just thinking maybe not so much of a virtue, but like in the sense of like setting a new trend. Saying things like, actually gifting ivory is so like last century, last millennium. It's just so out of date. So I guess people want to be like cool and trendy and all that. So I mean, has there been any sort of like study like this? Or what do you think that, whether this may or may not work?
As to whether there's been a study, precisely on that, I don't know, not that I know of, but quite possibly. I like the idea. I think, again, it has to be convincing. Just telling people that buying ivory is 2009 is, I don't know. But if it comes from a compelling, again, it's about, we tend to adopt the norms of people we identify with and we aspire to, which is why the whole celebrity thing can be quite effective. It tends to be, I think, a little bit overused, but it can be effective because if someone we really aspire to and as a role model is telling us that, oh, this is so passé, then maybe that would have some effect. I think it's a nice idea. It's definitely worth trying. But as we know, there's not a huge amount of research in this space that's really looked at this stuff in any detail. So I'm sure there's a very long list of really cool ideas that we could test. And if that's what we come to today, that's a pretty good outcome, I think. So.
I wanted to ask your thoughts on consumer service, because yesterday we were talking and saying about the difficulties of asking direct questions in consumer service, such as have you consumed this type of ivory in the past 6 months, or how much of ivory have you consumed over the last year, because people might like to lie or sort of cheat a little bit to say they're not using as much illegal product as they would normally. So I wanted to ask if it would be possible to maybe ask other questions as part of the survey, such as, do you consider yourself a good citizen? Do you consider yourself to contribute to the social good in the society, and then sort of reinforce the good image, and sort of people that might like to be more consistent with their behaviour and actually answer more truthfully in later questions.
Yeah, interesting. So that could go either way, actually. If you prime people to believe that they're a good, honest citizen, they might be more inclined to lie, because then they want to be consistent with that perception of a good. That said, there is evidence to show that honesty declarations up front before a questionnaire can be effective in the way that you describe. So, for example, with something as unexciting as a insurance form, when you're renewing your car insurance, for example, we have to write down how many miles a year we drive as an estimate. And that's one of those classic things where we all tend to lie a little bit. We tend to round it down a little bit because it makes the premium cheaper. And normally, you fill in all this stuff and then you sign at the end of the document saying, I declare that this is all truthful and so on. So there's a bit of evidence to suggest that if you put that declaration first, then people are more honest and informed than if you put it last. Because at the end, you've already lied, you've already done it. You're not going to go back and change it, you're just going to get everything. But if you get people to sign up first, I promise that the information that I'm about to fill in is honest. That seems to work a little bit. So I think you've got a nice idea there about priming honesty, but maybe not priming integrity, good citizenship, because that might motivate them to, you see the subtle distinction there. But yeah, again, it's a neat idea, definitely worth testing.
Okay, one more question.
So I'm from Save Vietnam Wildlife. So we do some survey recently, and we work with the community that go to the forest to hunt. I know it's not really about the change behavior consumer, but so we researched the hunter, why they go into the forest to hunt, and they said they don't know about the law, about the regulation, and because also the rangers don't stop them much. Like the law enforcement is not that strong. So that's why they go into the forest. And actually the hunters suggest if the law enforcement is stronger, they might not go because they stop them, the rangers stop them to go inside forest. So actually the hunters suggest that, not we suggest. And the thing is they don't know the regulations, and they don't know how much the fine is. So they don't know, like, it's not 1 million or 2 million, but it could be like billions of money, and they don't have that money to pay for if they get a fine. So I wonder if we have like a ban to the consumers. Like if it's like they store kind of percentage, I mean like kilograms of rocks, what they get, the penalty, the fine. So if that could affect the consumers to buy the things. Another case that we try to, first we encourage people that if they stop using the products, so it's good protect the wildlife, and it's better for their future, their children's future, that the young generation could see the beautiful wildlife. And another thing, we scare them that the wildlife product is something is not good for their health also. And I wonder if inspiration could make a good, better effect, or this, like the scary thing could make a better.
Great, thank you. Lots of things in there. So on the fear messaging, scaring people, so sort of emotions with a negative balance, that is things like fear, guilt, and so on, they can be effective at changing behaviour, but normally only if the behaviour change is quite easy to adopt. So, for example, I was chatting to some people last night actually and gave this example. If you feel guilty for not buying flowers for your mother on her birthday, you might do something about that. You might buy her a gift next time you see her, because that's a very easy way to resolve that guilt. But if you're being made to feel guilty for driving a car because it's bad for the environment, well, it's rather difficult to give up your car. You don't want to give up your car. Maybe you can't afford to, take public transport. Maybe it's inconvenient. And so in that instance, we tend to resolve the guilt not by changing our behaviour, but by ignoring the issue, just pushing it away. And so that's where you get things like denial and rationalisation and so on. And the same is somewhat true with fear. The fear is obviously a powerful motivator if we can do something about it, if we have that agency. If we're hopeless, then it's just depressing, and so we just try and ignore it. So you see this in medical research, for example. People are actually willing to pay to not know about an illness they've got, and they'll pay more the more severe the illness is, which is kind of perverse, because you think, well, people would want to know this, but actually if there's nothing they can do about it, they don't want to know. So scaring people is not always, it can be quite paralysing, but that said, like I say, it can be effective if what you're asking them to do is quite simple. So you might ask, well, if you're talking about, say, the use of rhino horn, well, I don't know where on that spectrum that would fall. If you scare people into thinking that rhino horn is going to be interest to them, that may work. It may not. I don't know. That's an empirical question that we should certainly test. But my point is, it could flip one way or another, so we need to evaluate this thing. Your comments on the logging, I think, is quite interesting, because often we do find that the people that are extracting the resource, the people that are illegally logging or illegally fishing or polluting the land through agricultural practices and so on, are sometimes the ones that want stricter regulation, because they want a more level playing field. So fairness is very important in that they feel like they have to extract, overlog, overfish, use unsustainable methods, because if everyone else is doing it, it becomes a sort of race to the bottom and you need to keep up with your competitors. Whereas if everybody was really strictly forced towards more sustainable practices, that's better for everyone. So it's kind of a tragedy of a common scenario where actually people might be happier if there's more enforcement. But then I think your third point was around finding consumers, is that right?
Yes.
So, yes, I think that could be effective, but I think it becomes quite complicated to administer. For example, if you have a piece of furniture made from illegally logged rosewood, how does the consumer know it's illegal? How does the authority know that it's illegal? So leveraging that fine at a consumer level point, I would think might be quite complex, but I'm not an expert on this. But in principle, from a behavioural perspective, I see no reason why it wouldn't be as effective. Again, it's worth exploring. But yeah, I'm interested. I don't know. Does that sound like a sort of practical solution to people? To me, my gut is that it's quite a complicated one to administer. But yeah, could well be effective.
Okay. Because of time, I have to wrap up the session. But I think Toby is around, right, for the rest of the day. I'm not running away. So you can grab him in coffee or lunch to further discuss with him. I'd like to give a big round of applause to him for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll be ready for loads of people to be grabbing you. Okay, just before we go into the coffee break, after the coffee break, I just need to give you some directions. because otherwise you're going to get lost. I know you are. So after the coffee break, we're going back into deep dive groups. Okay? So we want, during the coffee break, which will be 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes till 11:15, yeah? So we'll shove the agenda around an extra 15 minutes. You will come back and you will find the rooms have been sorted into partitions again. So you will be in the same place you were yesterday, except for the group that was with Gail and Samir in the Hanoi room will now be in the marketplace. Yeah, because there is another group working in the Hanoi room. But the rest of you will be in the same place you were yesterday. Yeah. So at 11:15, I will ring the bell and I will rally you all in, and I need you to go to where you were yesterday. So the principle, as we agreed yesterday, is that you will stay in the same deep dive working group. And then at 12:15, I will come again and I will ring the bell. And then you're going to change to a masterclass without any lunch. No, lunch will come after the masterclass. Yeah. So you will